Thank you all for listening to my talk on what's new and what's next. I'm Michael Dawson. I'm in the Node.js lead for Red Hat and IBM. That means I get to spend a lot of time in the community as well as working with teams within Red Hat and IBM and our customers. If you want to follow me, you can follow me on Twitter, reach out on LinkedIn, or contact me through GitHub. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what I'm going to cover, first of all, I'm going to talk about what's not new. I know the talk is what's new and what's next, but I think there's some things we should say about what's not new. I'm going to dive into a recent survey, the Next 10 team, who looks at what's going to make the project successful for the next 10 years. We did a survey again this year, so I'm going to dive into some of the results from that. And then finally, I'll get to what's new and what's next. So first of all, what's not new? Well, we continue to see massive usage of Node.js. So over the last year, we had 1 billion downloads from the website, almost 800 million Docker pulls, and that's after Docker keeps pushing people to use either their own proxies or other repositories because they want to make some money there. So I can easily say that we know of, there was at least 2 billion downloads over the last year. So continue to see massive usage of Node.js, probably the largest JavaScript runtime on the back end for sure. Node also continues to top all the recent surveys. If we look at the recent Stack Overflow survey, Node's ranked as the top framework that's used. If we look at the recent Octoverse, this has actually had to update this last week. Until then, JavaScript was #1 and #3. We're now #2 and #3. Python, with the AI craze, has sort of moved up. But they do note, if you read through the notes, that if you add JavaScript and TypeScript together, they're still growing faster, have more usage overall. And really, I consider that all Node usage. So I still think we're pretty much at the top there. I think we also have an active and vibrant project. These are some stats generated by the LFX Insights dashboard. You can see from the number of issues, the number of commits, we still have a lot of activity going on. Of course, we're a very large project, so we're not growing at thousands of % like you can if you've got 2 contributors. But we continue to grow contributors, and so I think we can say, we still have a really active and vibrant project. And the last thing is, I think Node.js still continues to be really relevant to major trends. There always seems to be some trend which is the thing that catches people's attention, that everybody's talking about that. When things move to the cloud, of course, Node was relevant because fast startup, small footprint. And today, AI and large language models is everything that you hear people talking about. What I really like is that you often see the leading AI libraries like LangChain, LlamaDex, and Ollama. They all start with Python, but JavaScript or TypeScript is typically the second language. So I think that's the AI community saying, well, we really see JavaScript and TypeScript is going to be one of the key languages that's used to consume AI and integrate it into the applications that actually deliver the value to the end users. So I take that as, Node.js is and will continue to be relevant to whatever the current trend is of the day. So now let's take a little bit at the survey. This year, we had close to 3,000 respondents. That was about 81% more than last year. And that's comparing, this is the second year that the Next 10 team did a survey. We've had other Node surveys in the past, but this is the one which is the most comparable. There's about involvement in using Node.js was about 6 years. If you look at the demographics and you look at the chart, we had a pretty nice representation of people from around the world. We have the US, but then we have lots of other countries. Similarly, if you look at the number of different sort of places people can come from, we have people who are just individuals using Node.js, but we have quite a good representation from people working at companies, startups, and so forth. And then finally, and I guess the writing is a little bit small, you can always go to the survey to see the details. We have the very large section, which is application developers, but we also have good representation from people writing, library developers, and even people who are actually running the tools and operating scale, systems at large. So I think a pretty nice representation of people to give us some information. In terms of the use cases, I always have kind of felt that it's like 50% of people writing back-end services, microservices, and 50% of people doing things like scripting or running front-end applications. And the survey kind of reflects that as well. We see people who are developing microservices, using serverless, and then we see people who are actually deploying their front-end applications or using it in basically all of the tooling that powers the generation of most of the web applications we see today. Then looking at where people do their development, I think if we look at production first, it's pretty much Linux where people deploy. There are some other operating systems like Windows and Mac that have a pretty small share, but either basically on bare metal or through Docker, we see most of the deployments that actually are on Linux. If we look at where people develop, however, we can see that it's a different story. Windows and Mac OS are obviously heavily used because that's what lots of people have on their workstations. Linux is growing. Still, 18% is actually a pretty significant percentage for people using that natively. And depending on how you look at the numbers, I think that might even be like 29%, because if you're using WSL or you're using Docker, I kind of consider that to be you're developing on Linux because you want to be close to your production environment anyway. But I do think it's a good reminder that we need a good user experience on all three of those different environments, because that's where our developers are doing their work. And so even if we're not deploying the applications there in the end, we want people to have a good experience when they're developing there. One of the things the Next10 team has done over the years is we developed with the project a set of technical priorities, and we've documented those in the repository. We also tried to understand the different constituencies and asked what was important to them. And in the survey this year, we asked about those to make sure that what we had still matched what the larger ecosystem was thinking. And really, I think they are a pretty good reflection. If you look at the other in the technical priorities, it's a pretty small number. So in terms of what was important to people and what they thought were working on, they mostly were reflecting on the things that we had documented, which I think is pretty good. Some key takeaways from the survey. The most common pain points are around ESM. I think we all know if we were in like an ESM only or a CGS only environment, everybody would probably be happy, but we're sort of in a middle ground where you have some CGS, some ESM, and that's where most of the sort of friction and challenges were reported. People also reported that it's not as easy to use TypeScript with Node as they would like it to be. And then the last three, documentation, monitoring, diagnostics, and performance, those are ones we typically see. Of course, we'd always like better documentation. When you have your applications in production, it's really important to monitor what's going on, as well as being able to diagnose what is going wrong if something's not going the way it should. And finally, performance often hits your bottom line. The more you can do with less CPU cycles, the less servers, that's going to cost you less, so people are always interested in having good performance. And I think you'll see later on when we talk about what's new and what's next, at least I think we're actually making some progress on those fronts, which is a good thing. Another sort of key interesting point was that ESM is widely reported. 71% of people reported that they have ESM syntax not like actually in their code base, not something that's being transpiled to or gotten to there in some other way. So that was kind of interesting. We also asked about stable features, how well people were using them, and we, in terms of like new stable features, and they have a pretty good usage. So it seems like we're promoting the features that people are interested in because they're getting used. Similarly, we asked about the experimental features, and all those features had a pretty good level of usage, and I think that's great because that means we should be getting feedback about do they fit are they in the shape that they should be? Do they fit what people want them to be in terms of as we progress them along their life towards becoming stable? So now let's move on to what's new. 2024 was an exciting year, and I'll talk about some of the highlights, progress on ESM, the support for TypeScript, some storage APIs, the web storage API, the SQLite API, continued progress on performance, and the introduction of Node Run. And as I mentioned before, if we think back to the survey pain points, we can see that actually progress is being made and enhancements in some of the areas where people reported in the survey that those were their biggest challenges, which I think is a good fit. In the other ones of docs and monitoring, when I talk about what's next, I think we have some coverage there as well. First, I just want to take a quick look at regular releases, though, because I think we shouldn't undervalue the work and the value that we get out of people basically working to make sure we have stable, reliable releases on a predictable release schedule. Our current last major release was just a few weeks ago. Number 23 was released in October. We have 3 ongoing releases, the 18, 20, and 22. If you're on 18, you only have 4 or 5 months, so you really should already be thinking about transitioning to 22. And as our release process has 2 currents, December majors, every 6 months, the next current will be in April. So let's dive into ESM compatibility to start with. The really nice thing that I saw when the agenda for the conference came out was that I was earlier on in the agenda. And that's good because I'm going to give you kind of a surface look at some of these features. And there'll be other people actually diving into a lot more detail. So for example, Joey has a talk later on about the require. And there's also a talk later on from Jeffrey about ESM type detection. So a number of these, you're actually going to get a lot more details later on. But to start out with ESM compatibility, as I mentioned before, one of the things in the survey is people struggle having to mix ESM and CGS together. And this is a feature which is now on by default in 23. And it allows you to basically create your ESM file. So I just created my greeter file here in ESM. And I can now require that in a CGS file. And if I run that, it just works. There would be fireworks there if I was actually driving off the main project off the internet, but I just decided to use a PDF locally because of the internet. There is a little bit of fine print. The features are still experimental. You can turn them off if you need to, because there's a couple options to do that. But they are on by default in 23. You shouldn't necessarily get any warnings. And you can only require your ESM if it's synchronous, because require is synchronous, and we can't change the laws of physics effectively. So your ESM has to be synchronous as well. The other thing about this working just out of the box, the code that I showed you, is it uses experimental module detection. That's something where you may actually Node might have to try and load your file twice to figure out which the syntax is. So it's actually still recommended that you put into the package.json the type module so that you can avoid that overhead if you don't need to have it happen. The second exciting one was TypeScript. At a glance, there's two options that we're at: experimental strip types and experimental transform types. The experimental strip types just replaces the TypeScript with whitespace, so there's no need to use source maps because we haven't changed the format of the code. And the experimental transform types supports a larger subset of TypeScript. And again, this is one where there'll be a more in-depth talk. Marco's going to go into detail on this one later on today, I believe. There are a couple key limitations. It only supports a subset of TypeScript, so it's not intended to replace a full TypeScript toolchain, but it is intended to make it easier to get started with using TypeScript. And it is something I've already had a number of people at Red Hat reach out to me and say, oh, that's great. When I'm working on my script files, I can start using TypeScript without having to have like a tool chain to go through the compilation stuff. It doesn't handle files in the Node modules directory, and that's actually by design. The belief is that you should still publish your code in JavaScript format. Of course, there's conversations around that, but that's the current design choice. It doesn't do things like read a configuration file for it, which again, restricts you to a little bit more limited use cases. And sometimes it needs a little bit more information, like adding a type keyword so that it can figure out what's going on. I wrote a simple application to try this out. So I have my greeter here. I used some slightly more advanced features just so we could go through the progress of actually trying it out. So I used enums, and otherwise you can see it's basically pretty straightforward TypeScript. So I have my greeter, and then which is going to actually concatenate the world to the hello, and then we've got the hello which imports that and then uses it. So if we tried running that without any of the options, well, this is the experience that you would have known before the feature. I say hello, or node hello TS, and it says like, well, I don't know anything about TypeScript. So let's start by adding the next command line option. So I can add the experimental strip types. What I like about this is I actually use something which requires the other feature, which was the enums. It requires some transformation. But what I really like is you get a really nice error. I could tell immediately what was going on from this. It's telling me, well, sorry, you're using something that needs some transformation that's not supported with the basic strip types, and points me directly to it. So I add the second file, the second option, and it just works. So this is just a quick example of like, hey, I can now write my TypeScript and I can get it running quite easily. Now, when I first wrote this slide, put the slide together, TSC had a problem. Though, although Node could run that TypeScript, it couldn't actually compile that TypeScript and run it. But I was very happy to be able to cross out the has and replace it with had, because one of the things that happened here, I think, is a really good example of how the project can make a space for both the project and external teams to collaborate. Marco created a TypeScript team, people from the TypeScript team within the Node project, and people from the TypeScript team actually came and joined. There was discussion of like some of the edge cases, some of the challenges, and today there's already a PR which adds this rewrite relative imports and lets us actually take that same TypeScript, compile, and run it. There were some other options that looked like they might let you do that, but when you tried to use them, it turns out that you couldn't actually emit the compiled code. It would just give you the headers and the types and stuff like that. So, but it's, I think, just a really good example of the collaboration that the project can enable by providing a space for those kind of places, those discussions to take place. Moving on to the experimental web storage API, the project over the years, if you've been following it, has been working to provide web compatibility where it makes sense. Node isn't a web browser, so not everything is going to make sense, of course, but in places where it does, people have been working to make that happen. And Colin put in some good work here to add local storage and persistence and session storage. One gives you in-memory key value pair storage. The other one gives you storage which is persistent. You can basically, on the local storage line, specify a file, and it will write your key value pairs to there. And if you start up Node again, you can get them again. Now, the web storage API, to actually implement that, SQLite was added as a dependency to Node. And that started the discussion of, well, why don't we have a SQLite API in Node itself? That's not as crazy as you might think off the top of your head, because other languages have already done that. So language like Python and a number of other ones already incorporate a SQLite API. And I don't think this is going to replace your production database. If you've got some big PostgreSQL databases or Oracle databases running, you're probably not going to replace those. But I have installed a number of products myself where I can see they're using SQLite under the covers. And so I think this is great in terms of making it easier for Node to be able to be used where you need a little bit more complex configuration and storage database without having to rely on an external database. As you can see, the API basically lets you run, like in the DB exec, I can just run direct SQL statements. If you've run SQL, it will look very familiar. It also lets you create prepared statements, which you should always be using to avoid SQL injection attacks. And then I can run those prepared statements, just inserting some text and basically running the reads prepared statement, and you can see it just gives me back an object with the values that were in the database. Still, as you can see, an experimental feature, but I think something that's really going to be used a lot in the future. And then I'll just finish up in terms of what's new in terms of continued progress on performance. Majors always generally get a new version of V8. We get new JavaScript features, but often better performance as well from that. And Michael Zasso does a lot of work to make sure we keep up fairly current with V8 versions. Languages that have a just-in-time compiler get a real benefit by being able to basically take your JavaScript code and compile them into native code and then run faster. But it sometimes takes a little while for the just-in-time compiler to do that, and then it actually takes some cycles to do the compilation. Being able to do that in advance and caching that work, and that's what this Node compile cache is about, will enable faster startup. And that's something Joey's been working a fair amount over the last few months to be able to enable Node to have a cache that we can use that. So that's going to help startup, which is great. And then people like Yagas and Robert have been working on things like buffer and file system improvements, just making those go faster. So I think we can see we continue to work on performance over time as well. And then the last sort of functional thing I'll mention is Node Run. It's really convenient to start your application. We see lots of people doing this, starting their applications with npm start. That's actually not really good practice. If you've ever read the Red Hat and IBM Node.js reference architecture, we recommend against starting with npm. A number of reasons, like you're increasing your attack surface by having npm actually in your shipping container, your production container. There can be problems with signals and so forth. So I think the Node Run addition is a really nice addition in terms of it's something that can help people move towards better practice while still taking the convenience of being able to have what you need to start codified in the package JSON itself. So that's sort of what's new. What's next? Again, don't have the graphic going, but the Node project is like this, and if you saw it moving, everything's going every which way, totally unpredictable, really hard to keep on top of everything that's going on. Lots of people going all in their own directions, I guess, is really what it shows. So how can you keep on top of what's next? Well, you could consume the GitHub notifications. I try and clear out all the GitHub notifications once or twice a week. That's a lot of work, and just even reading the titles to see which ones you think are important or not important is something. So I wouldn't recommend starting with that. Much better is getting involved in some of the working groups and teams, or groups of people who are interested in certain areas get together and collaborate. That's a nice way. We have some strategic initiatives that you can look at. The Next 10 also has some initiative that it's working on. Releases are actually a really good way because we flow code back into LTS releases. Looking at the notable changes in the existing LTS releases is a nice way to figure out what's new and what's next. And finally, actually, the Next 10 team put together this Node.js newsfeed. And it's a way we're trying to roll up information from the project. It includes some things like releases and stuff by default. But teams can have an issue where if we post news there, it'll get rolled up, and you can get that in the newsfeed as well. Still a challenge to trying to get stuff into the feed, but it's another one of the ways you can get stuff. And Ulysses within the project did a great job sort of putting all the automation together around that. The Next 10 team itself, what are we focusing on? Well, if we saw the technical priorities I touched base on earlier, we think those are pretty well aligned with what the community thinks is important. So we're not so much focused on those because we've spent a good amount of time, but we're pretty much aligned that. So for this year, the current focus areas are a little bit less technical, more on things like advocacy and promotion. One of the things we're doing right now is we're starting to roll out the ambassador program. And that's trying to work a little bit more closely with some people who are out in the community producing good Node content, but aren't necessarily as closely tied to the project. So they're not like people who are making commits to Node Core daily and stuff like that. But we think by sort of creating a program where we collaborate a little bit more closely and provide a path for them to talk to some of the people in the project and for us to put together like this is what we think the important messages are to get out there, we can have something which is going to be beneficial to all. So we're just starting to onboard our first 2 ambassadors into that program. The next one is, we know there's lots of people out there using Node, and we'd love to see more corporate usage stories. So we're really brainstorming how can we do that in a really light touch way where, maybe we just ask people to write their own story, right? And if we could find people to do that, say once a month or something like that, we think that would be a nice thing. Still trying to figure that out. Talked about the newsfeed, and then we're looking at some of the things around how do we keep the project, how do we keep it going? So we're looking at funding. People have suggested like maybe we should get an open collective and stuff like that. So we're talking about those different ideas. And then also trying to figure out, are there things we can do in terms of collaborator health to make the project continue or improve to be a good place to work? We had a survey, and we're going to look at some of that survey data in the summit, which is actually following this conference. So what's next? Well, I think we're going to see continued work on those key technical priorities that are documented in the project. So we're going to see ongoing progress technically on ESM, TypeScript performance, Quick, a lot of the things we've seen good work already this year. But what about the other pain points? Well, for documentation, Claudio, and if you saw, we're at last year's NodeConf, he did a good presentation on the updates to the website. He really drove that update to the website, and he started to loop back to Doc's initiative, which he'd started a couple years ago. And I think he's really, I'm very optimistic that he's going to help improve the tooling on that front, and that's going to help us be able to make the documentation more consumable, as well as hopefully easier to get new content in. So I think initiative on that front that should help us with the docs. And then on the diagnostics, monitoring diagnostics team, I guess I'd say it's more of a slow burn on that side. There is a diagnostics team. There is progress being made. For example, Stephen rewrote async local storage so that it doesn't use the async hooks underneath the covers. Some key components like require in the middle that lots of the APMs use were moved into the organization, and there's discussion of doing the same in import in the middle. And really, I think that's just like another good example of the project providing a space for different teams and different companies to collaborate on some important technology, and in this case, in the monitoring and diagnostics front. So just wanted to mention that because that was another one of the pain points that was mentioned. And I guess that takes me to the end. So thank you very much, and hope we all enjoyed the conference.